Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 10th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this train on the tracks, the way that I pay the edit team, and the way that I am able to continue to include my incredible producer on the show, Noelle Dilworth, is through the support of individuals just like you. So the model that we use for the show is the Patreon model, which is very similar to kind of a NPR or PBS model, where individuals who can afford to support the show and who choose to support the show can make a per episode donation by visiting patreon.com/talk nerdy. As large or as small as you want, that really does help offset everything. And it makes it so that individuals who are not in a position to pay don't have to pay, but can fully appreciate every single episode in now our back catalog of, 506 episodes. 100% for free. This week's top patrons include, let's see, Anu Baravaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. So let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Leila Takayama. She is a human-robot interaction specialist with a long history of training and publication in social science and design across robotic and actually AI systems as well. So she earned her PhD from Stanford University. And she has worked in a lot of different multidisciplinary organizations. Currently, she is the vice president of design and human-robot interaction for Robust AI. And she's going to tell us a little bit more during the show about the really cool work that Robust AI is doing. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Leila Takayama. Well, Leila, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So I am excited to talk all about your interesting work in AI and robotics and kind of human machine, relationships and design. But before we get into the work that you're actively doing, I'm super curious. I think my listeners probably know this by now because I tend to follow a bit of a formula, but I'm super curious how you got to where you are. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about your background and your education.
Sure. So my background is actually closer to yours. So I have a background in psychology, and I started out in cognitive science, which is, this interdisciplinary field where you study neuroscience and computer science and psychology, philosophy, linguistics. And so I kind of stumbled into looking at human-computer interaction first, because computers are so poorly designed to work for people. And then I stumbled into human-robot interaction next because they're even worse, which is, kind of a sorry state of the world. But it felt to me like, robotics has all this promise, supposedly, right? Sci-fi tells us that it's going to be amazing. And then you actually interact with robots and it's just awful. And so I feel like there's a big disconnect there that could actually be addressed by folks who understand what people can do and what they want to do. And how do we, amplify human skills as opposed to try to just do exactly what humans do already.
So it's interesting thinking that, coming from cognitive science, this study of the human mind and brain and how it relates to all of these things is so fundamental for, whether we're talking about computing or robots. We are the users and we are those who engage, yet at the same time, it's not always the case that I guess, layer is included from the onset, is it? Like, oftentimes we're talking like engineers, physicists, people who aren't thinking about the human aspect.
Absolutely. As much as I love my engineering friends, they often design things for themselves, or for their best friends, right? And so I think when you do that, you're limited in what you're going to actually come up with, and you're limited in who's going to be able to use your stuff. And so um, a lot of the folks that I work with today are more, folks who have had that perspective and may have fallen flat on their faces, and been frustrated that no one was like smart enough to use their robot or use their, computer. And then they want more, right? The ones who want their wonderful tools to get put in the hands of a broader population of people are the ones who want to engage more with human centered design. And so they tend to be the ones that I'm gravitated towards, because, they care about people who are not exactly like themselves.
Right. And that's such an important point is when we talk about human-centered design, there is no one way to be human. It's so variable, so we have to sort of be creative in making sure that we reach the human experience as the kind of royal we.
Yes, I think for me, one of the biggest red flags is when somebody tells me, I made this awesome robot. And I ask them, cool, who's going to use it? And their answer is everyone.
Right.
That's when I know, like, okay, we got some work to do here. Let's get a little more specific. Right.
Yeah, I used to when I would worked, for quite some time in television, and I used to struggle with that as well when I would read for a new show or we'd be, talking about how we're going to host this thing or how we're going to approach it. And yeah, when the network or the production company would be like, it's like, well, okay, so who's the audience? They're everyone. It's like, I can't talk to everyone. I have to know who I'm talking to. I don't talk to children the same way I talk to adults, and I don't talk to experts the same way I talk to people who don't have expertise in these topics.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the same problem, right? When you're designing a computational system, right?
Ugh,
You got to know, like,
fascinating.
who are these people? What are they trying to do? What do they know? Like, what are they capable of? And then you can figure out, like, is this going to work for them or not?
And I think maybe the individual listener right now who doesn't work in a sort of tech field may not I'm kind of speaking for myself here, but may not sort of realize or often think about how many different ways that humans interact with machinery, with computational machines, with robots. Like I think we're all thinking about like our phones and our laptops. And so, my everyday interaction, I'm the user and my phone needs to be user friendly for everybody. But there are so many different industries and so many different applications, aren't there, where you have to think really specifically.
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, I think maybe another, if we want to go the robot direction, right? Probably the most popular robot in the world would be the Roomba, right? So the little vacuum cleaning robots that look like a big hockey puck, right? And most people who have pets that have fur tend to have one of these robots too. And I think, that's another common example of like a hardware software system that's in our everyday lives. And, sometimes we don't call it robot, right? You just call it like it's the vacuum cleaner because it vacuums. And it's really great that it does that for me. And as you're saying, right, not everyone orients towards these the same way. Not everyone has uses them the same way. I think one of the beautiful things about robots in particular is that they tend to come with some, gender norms. A really good friend of mine, Jody Forlisi, who's at Carnegie Mellon, did this awesome study where they gave randomly assigned half of these families a Roomba, and they randomly assigned the other half an equally valuable in terms of price tag vacuum like cleaning stick that you just hold in your hand and push around. And they let them just like use them or not, whatever, right? And they came back and interviewed them a few times just to see how it was going. And cleaning the house tends to be gendered female, right? And so women tend to be expected to take on that work. But when you have a power tool that's called a robot in your house, guess who helps out more with cleaning the house? Which is just great, right? Like that wasn't an intended outcome, but the men participated more in cleaning the house because it was a robot. But they didn't when it was just a handheld vacuum stick. Right.
Ugh, that's
So
fascinating.
I love that
Oh, and
result.
and
Yeah.
such a sorry state. I mean, and that must be also kind of sometimes frustrating when you're wanting to design or to approach these problems based on usability, and at the same time, you probably don't want to reinforce like gender norms or like racist or sexist approaches. And so, what a difficult thing to say. We want to overcome, but we also want to make sure that it fits within the zeitgeist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they seem to have come up with a design that kind of works across the genders, right? Which is kind of nice to see. It doesn't always work that way, right?
Right. And it's interesting that you did mention the kind of gendered nature because you're right. I do think that we often think of robots as being um, male or as somehow relating to male tasks more. Why? Where do you think that that comes from?
If I have to watch another robot deliver beer to someone sitting on a couch, I'm gonna scream. Uh, like for some reason, everyone thinks that this is a new idea, but grad students in research labs have been doing this for decades now, and you can guess what the majority of those grad students are in terms of gender. Um,
Right. And
yeah,
is that why you think? Because they are like because historically the field was dominated by men, so the perspectives were very it was very male gaze?
that would be my guess. Yeah, is that just participation in imagining a future with robots, right, has largely been dominated by men. It doesn't That's not true everywhere. I will say, like in my fields, right, I study human robot interaction. We have better representation of women in the field. It's not 50-50, I don't think. But, when I go to the human robot interaction design conferences and you go to the bathroom, there's actually a line in the women's restroom. And we celebrate that because that's not true at the straight up robotics conferences.
Right. And so there is it's interesting that the minute you add the human component, more women feel comfortable entering the field.
Or we're super frustrated with what they look like right now, and so we're rolling up our
Right.
sleeves and we want to fix it, right?
Yeah,
Designing
and so
for inclusivity.
absolutely, and I think and this extends sort of beyond hardware, right? Because we often think about robots as a form of hardware, but we're also talking about the software, the um the why of it all, the how of it all, and actually what these different things are doing, whether they have a physicality or like in with regards to something like artificial intelligence, that this is sort of this thing that's happening in the background, to accomplish some sort of task or some sort of goal. But those gender concerns exist regardless of whether we're talking
Absolutely.
hardware or not, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, like a voice agent, right? So there's been a lot of talk lately about Her, right, the film, and using like voice casting, right? Like, who are you going to voice cast and why? Like, what is the character that you're trying to show or present to your end users, right? That's a very big and important design decision. And whether we like it or not, we do use stereotypes because they're shortcuts, right? They're heuristics that people use cognitively because we're cognitive misers, right? We're kind of lazy when it comes to thinking through things. Um, and if you, for example, presented a bunch of information about products that are stereotypically feminine, right? So it's, let's say, cleaning products or fashion, right? Um, People will actually believe you more and buy more stuff if you use a female voice agent than a male one. Whereas if you're selling things that are stereotypically male, say, I don't know, power tools or sports equipment, right? People who hear it from a male voice agent are more likely to believe them and buy more stuff from them than if it's female. And all of that, like, we will deny that we're doing that because we know that that's not right. Um, but then if you look at consumer behavior, it follows those patterns, right? We're falling back on those social norms that are sort of deeply ingrained in us because that's the world that we live in and that's the experiences that we've had and those patterns that we see. And so I think one of the frustrating things, but also like, a good thing to know about because it could drive the way that we choose to design things is like picking the perceived gender or the perceived age or the perceived like geographic origin of even just voice agents, not robots, right? Because we use those stereotypes to make sense of these agents that we're interacting with today.
Yeah, and it's interesting the example that you use there. It's such a, I think, clean example of, I'm thinking about my own consumer behavior and I'm like, yeah, totally. I don't want like a man trying to sell me like makeup or something like that. But then right, exactly. But then you move into this, what I find to be a bit more pernicious utilization of sort of the female voice to encapsulate helper roles. So like, oh, my calendar, my assistant, yeah, that she's because right, it's the man who does the real work and then it's the woman who supports the man. And I think that it's so sad because we were supposed to have moved past that. And I know we're not past it. Of course, we're not past it, but we're not in the era of like the Mad Men executives in their offices and all the female secretaries sitting out in the bullpen. We're not in the era anymore. I mean, I remember going to Caltech and being like, why are there only men's restrooms on why are the restrooms on separate floors? And they're like, oh, because back in the day, this is where the scientists were. And like all the women were, answering phones. Like, Jesus. But now we're just reinforcing that again.
Yeah, yeah. And as designers of these systems, we don't have to, right? I think like the beauty of technology is you can decouple these things that used to be coupled. And I think so. My old grad school advisor, Cliff Nass, used to say, like, wouldn't it be cool if like the physics teachers that are virtual were all female? And so kids grew up expecting their physics instructors to be female, right? Like that's fine. That's super doable. And it's just a matter of voice casting, right? And so we could actually change what people are exposed to in order to start to change those patterns that people are noticing in society, even if they face different ones later, right?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. Like there's nothing essentialist about this. There's no fundamental difference. These are all norms that have been shaped over millennia of very often people in power maintaining that power.
Yeah, and we can shake them up, right?
I love that. And it takes me to this other um hot topic that I see a lot when discussing things like AI, especially or large language models. This idea of um I don't want the robots or I don't want the AI to be making art and music and poetry. I want the AI to be like doing my dishes.
Yes,
Like why?
yes, I
Like
saw that tweet and I love it.
yeah. And so,
Yeah.
but I think this is an important kind of conversation that's been happening quite a bit. And I'm curious your take on that, because I'm sure that that's sort of front and center for you and your work.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, we talked earlier about like who is this for? I think the very next question and what is it for? Like what's it going to do, right? And why do we want that to do that thing? Um, a nice rule of thumb that is from robotics is that robots should do things that are dirty, dangerous, and dull. Um, I would add to that like things that could be damaging to people. But we call them the 3Ds, right? And I think we don't have that yet for AI, right? We have people working on AI safety and thinking about, ethics and policy. But I think we don't have like a nice framework yet for thinking about how are you really going to decide which tasks are worth tackling first. um, Coming from a human-centered design perspective, usually what I do is figure out like, okay, who are we working with, what do they care about, and what do they hate about, what are their pain points, and how do we work on those first, right? Because if you go and take away the thing that they love about their job first, like guess what's going to happen? That robot's going to get hijacked. Someone's going to hit that big red button and shove it aside, right? But if you take on the tasks that they really wish weren't part of their job and you give them more time to do the things that they do love, I think that can make a really big difference in terms of adoption and long-term use.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'm starting to see it in the medical field more and more where at least I'm being served ads right now. Like, I love spending time with my patients. I don't love charting. I don't want to write notes. And that is a perfect example. I don't want an AI to replace me in face to face with my patients, but I also do want technology to help me with the menial and like massive time suck parts of my job.
Yeah, there's super tedious parts of our jobs that everyone would love to get rid of, right? Or maybe the backbreaking part of your job, right? Maybe you want to work on the part that actually makes use of your special skills, right? Like having a good bedside manner, right, with the patient. Those are things that I think in my like most optimistic future of these systems, we would be building AI systems and robotic systems that are complementary to us because we already know how to make things that are just like us. It's called like, making babies. Um, and I think if we can build things that complement our skills so that we can do better, right? That's a more powerful way forward than just trying to replicate what we've already got. And I find, I mean, you know this, right? Like there's a lot of people talking about artificial general intelligence or AGI. And my question is like, why do we want to make it smart
Yeah,
the
why do
same
we
way
even
we
want
are?
that?
Like we have
Yeah,
so many limitations. Like I don't
right.
what I want is something that's better than me in other ways. My memory is not great, right? And but computer memory can be pretty awesome compared to that. And like why aren't we excited about leveraging that, right? And working together better.
It's interesting. You mentioned something there that kind of struck me. One of the topics that I remember speaking about on the other podcast that I work on The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and the host Stephen Novella talking about this tendency of human beings, and there may even be a name for it, like the cognitive bias. There may be a name for it, but this tendency of human beings when they are first innovating to try to do exactly what you mentioned. It's like reinvent the thing that we already have. So, like when you look at the first cars, they look like horse
Yeah.
carriages. Like they look at because
Right.
that's
Right.
how you would get
It's
around. So of course
familiar.
the car's going to look like that. And it took time to iterate and go, oh wait, that's actually not the most ideal shape of a car. We can make it more streamlined. And do you think we're in that era right now with robotics and AI, or do you think we're still like making horse buggies?
I think we're still making horse buggies, or at least a lot of folks are still making horse buggies. And yeah, that's just the stage of technological development. And I think we've still got a lot of learning to do. And I don't mean machine learning; I mean like human learning, right? Like once you actually deploy these things and put them in the hands of end users and see what really happens, like that's where I think we can start to learn, right? Like maybe having better. Um, more streamlined designs, right, of those cars can help because they're moving faster, right? And what does that look like for a chatbot? And what does that look like for a floor cleaning robot, right? We're still in the very early days of trying to stumble our way there.
And can I ask, as somebody who's done a lot of academic work, who works with students, who like experiences also, maybe from like a consulting perspective, like the inner workings of sort of corporate America and how they think. Bear with me on this question. Hopefully I can get to the root of it. I think about sort of the capitalist ethos of grow, 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 improve, 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 progress, 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 right? And I think about how those pressures on industries often induce a need, an urge, a compulsion almost to solve problems that don't even exist. Like, how often is that something that you've grappled with in your work? Like seeing people coming up with these newfangled ideas where you're like, what solution does that? Like, what problem are you solving with that? Like, we don't need that just for the sake of
Totally.
making it.
Oh, we see that a lot. I mean, I would call that the culture of like the demo or die culture, right? Like you got to do something flashy because the executives are coming or because the investors are coming, right? And that cycle of just demoing and demoing and demoing and doing whatever is shiny will get you somewhere, but it's not necessarily going to get you to the point of providing real value to a set of customers who might actually want that thing in their homes or want that thing in their workplace, right?
Right,
And
like the
so I think,
equivalent of like a one-hit wonder
oh,
product or something,
totally,
like
yeah,
yeah, it's on the shelf and then people get tired of it really fast because it's not actually
yeah.
solving the problem.
Yeah. And you may have seen, especially in hospitals, right? There's been quite a few people trying to build robots for hospitals.
Oh, there are robots in
Um,
the hospital where I work, 100%. They come
nice.
in and out of
Doing
the elevator
delivery?
sometimes.
Yes. Do you ever get in the elevator with them?
Yeah, I think the ones that I've seen so far are usually with a handler still.
Ah, okay, that's
So,
smart.
like, they look like ET, they're like the size of ET, I would say. So, like, diminutive humans, and they have sort of some of those human-like face, with the eyes and stuff, I think to make them more palatable and easier to interact with. I don't know yet what they do, um, but I do see them going in and out, and usually there's, like, somebody following them with a clipboard.
Yeah, so they're in the learning stage. Trying to figure out what it's for. So that's good. That's a good first sign. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, as you've also probably seen, right? There's often places, including hospitals, where they just sort of have robots on display. And my friend Matt Bean down at UC Santa Barbara has done a ton of work on this space where, there is marketing value for a hospital to show, like, we have robots, we are from the future, right? And sometimes patients will, ask for the robot for their surgery, right? Instead of having human hands in their body. And so there's certainly marketing value that some companies are leaning into. I think, that's one step forward, maybe. But it makes me sad when I see robots that were designed to perform a task instead just being used for advertising,
Yeah,
than
that is
really
a
being used.
bummer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about, like, it's funny because I'm sure there is a lot of value in a robot-assisted laparoscopy, but when I had my, and, fans of the show know about it because I talked about it on air, but when I had cancer, now almost 2 years ago, and I had a, a laparoscopic hysterectomy, it was comforting to know that my surgeon, who had been my gynecologist for years and I knew very well, was going to be the one doing the surgery. And that's not to say that a robot assisted surgery, it's like there's no people in the room. Like, of course, there's still surgeons doing the surgery. But I think we're at the stage where having it be a robot is not comforting to me yet.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and if you if you get to see those surgical robots right now, they're a little scary, right? Um, and so there, you gotta look at the data, right? Like, what are the patient outcomes? Like, is it actually better? Does it help with, like, shortening the recovery time? At the end of the day, you're right, like, especially in the US, right? Those robots for surgeries are teleoperated by a surgeon, right? And there's a lot of controls to make sure that they don't do the wrong thing. Um, yeah. When
And
my
this is a great
partner
thing if it means, increasing equity, if it means more people being able to have the service, available to them or to do it cheaper or having a surgeon who's, not local, but who's very good at this thing. Now maybe they can perform it across the country. I mean, that's amazing.
that
But I'm
would be
still really
cool.
wary.
Yeah, especially with, the internet being as reliable as it is
Oh,
over
seriously,
long
yeah, the internet
distances.
just hiccuped while I was on with a client earlier. I was doing therapy and the internet froze, like, "Oh, you're frozen. Oh god," like, this is we're not living in a world yet where the infrastructure always supports these things.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a long way to go there.
And
It's like
and
setting up audio-visual
Mhm.
connections, as you know well, right? Like, it's hard to get it to work. It's hard to get the HVAC system in a building to work too, so, everyone's comfortable at their temperature.
Right. So reliability is and I think reliability of a machine, of whether we're talking about a robot or like an AI, reliability is directly linked to trust. And so how do you kind of figure trust into the work that you do?
Oh my gosh, so much, right? There are so many ways that robots can break our trust, right? And I think one of the very common ways that they do that is that we overpromise on what they can do. People have watched those, fancy demo or die videos, and they get really excited about them because they think the robots can actually do more than they actually can. And so I think one of the big challenges that we face with the AI systems too, right? They're trained on a certain data set, and then they're deployed in maybe a different kind of setting, and you cross your fingers and just hope that it's going to work okay. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so I think setting expectations with end users is super important for earning the trust, right? And being honest about what is possible and what we're not so sure about yet, right? Letting them know when they're getting into the territory that maybe you should be ready to catch it in case it falls, right? If you're going to use it over there. But if you use it over here, it's going to be fine. Um, and it's not just education, it's also just like, figuring out how to be more transparent at the right time, right? At the right place with those end users to let them know when they're sort of at the edges of what we know works.
Right. Like, I think there is sometimes there's a struggle. I don't know if this is a Western thing. I don't know if this is an American thing. There's this struggle with reconciling reality with sort of, I mean, I live in Los Angeles, right? And like the streets of Hollywood don't look like what it looks like in the movies. And I think we
Yeah, it's
often
not a set. Yeah.
exactly, but but we have been fed a visual story on a set for so long that we expect
Yeah.
that.
Pristine sidewalks. Yeah.
Yes, and so when it comes to AI, when it comes to robotics, I think that maybe there is some cynicism that we see, but I think overwhelmingly there's also this frustration that you often see with individuals that things don't always work the way that they expect them to, or that we haven't sort of made more progress without really taking the time to appreciate the incredible amount of progress that we have made.
Yeah. I've actually been talking with more than a few academic friends about this because, there is just like there's the pressure to demo or die, right, in the corporate culture. There's also in academia, there's this pressure to publish or perish, right? We love the alliteration. And with publishing, like you better have a result, right? And if you don't have a result or your system doesn't perform as well as the last one, right, like you don't get to tell anyone, which
Right,
is
yeah,
kind
that
of
the negative
dumb.
results just, like, they
Yeah,
die.
right. And there are folks who are fighting that trend, but it's going to be a long and uphill battle. Um, the idea that we've been floating around for robotics that is starting to get some traction is that, when you go to a robotics conference, there's usually all these videos of like the cool thing that this lab got their robot to do. We want to open another track in which we do the blooper reels, where we
Oh, I
show
love that.
all the failed attempts
Yeah.
because we can learn from that, right? And also, it'll help people understand like robotics is hard, AI is hard, right? Then, in order to see the progress, you got to see the failures too. And I think making more of a fuss about how hard it is and when the failures happen would help, right? With being more transparent with the rest of the world about where the technology actually stands.
Yeah, and I think that that even spreads out. It's funny, but I'm always trying to, like, make these parallels. Sometimes they don't they're not as parallel as they are in my mind, but I think that's the same thing when we talk about the scientific method, and really in a lot of ways, it's the same thing when we talk about a humanistic approach to, like, politics and governance. It's like, if we can normalize making mistakes, learning from mistakes, and improving based on the knowledge we got when we made that mistake, I think that we will be less of a culture of, "You changed your mind, therefore I don't trust you," or, you know, I want it's like this weird thing where we want, like, our leaders to be, like, unwavering, and it's like, why is that a good thing? Like, don't we want people who grow?
Right, right. Yeah, and I think, this idea of like having a learning culture, right, is super important. In Silicon Valley, where I am right now, right, there's this cult. People say that there's a culture of failing fast and early, but we forget the step of like, and then you learn. Like you learn from the mistake. And ideally, you share the lessons that you learned with others, right, who are working in a similar space so that you save them from bashing their head against that same wall later.
And you prevent the Elizabeth Holmes of the world, because what it's the culture that creates this compulsion to cheat and lie your way into, success, because, of course, like,
All
if
the
you're a failure,
pressures
you're
to
a failure.
lie. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, obviously, when somebody does something like that and commits fraud, like, it is their fault that they committed fraud, but they're not doing it in a vacuum, they're doing it in a culture that fully was asking them to do that,
totally, totally.
reinforcing those decisions.
Yeah, and you gotta walk that fine line as someone who's raising money for your startup, right? You're gonna tell your potential investors about things that you're excited about for the future, But in practice, it's really hard to promise that you're going to get it done, right? Because you're doing something new. You're actually, you're doing research, quite frankly, and we don't know what's going to happen, and that's why it's exciting, and you want to bring them along for the ride. But when you're in a culture where you need to make promises so that investors think they're going to get a return on their investment, you might make those claims too strongly, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so much to navigate, right? I think we're living in a society now where, I mean, thinking about you and your role and your position, we can no longer just do one thing or be one thing. Like, I think gone are the days of like our parents or our grandparents who sort of they made widgets in the factory and they put the left side of the widget on all day every day and they were left, expert and that and then they retired. Now you have to know something about the marketing and you have to know something about, the sales and you have to it's very, very difficult to not be interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I remember, actually, majoring in cognitive science. My parents would often ask me, like, "What is that? Is that really a thing?" Like, I don't know. Maybe you should pick a real major, right?
You're like, "It's all the
Uh,
things."
it's a really a thing, I swear. But I do feel like maybe that was good practice, right? For this time when, like, yeah, you have to know more than one thing. We don't get to only be deep in one area because that just don't work, right?
And we can't put all our eggs in one basket in that way either. I even think about I worked as a science journalist for years and years and years. I finally decided to go back to school. I just finished my PhD last year at 39 years old. And when people Oh, sorry, what?
Oh, congrats! That's awesome.
Oh, thanks.
That is quite the hurdle
I was
at
like,
any
I'm gonna
age. Yeah.
I'm gonna stop and appreciate that.
Yes, you
And
should.
you know what it's like because you did it too.
Yeah.
And so, it's when people go, well, why PhD and not MFT or why PhD and not PsyD or why did you choose the path that you chose? And it's like, because I want options. Like, I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. And so if I want to do private practice, I can. If I want to work in the hospital, I can. If I want to get an academic position, I can. And I think that it's the same sort of reasoning with having a broad skill set, also having a focused area of expertise, but knowing that you need to be somewhat light on your feet, I think allows you to do what it is that you're doing in this field, which is maybe I almost want to say it's like bringing empathy to the table.
Yeah.
Is that
I
a weird
that
way to put it? Like you
that is a
bring
great way to put
empathy
it.
to this field.
Yeah, I've actually so I used to teach human computer interaction at the university. And I remember I had one student one day who came out to me and we're like, gathering feedback on how's the class going for you. And the student wrote to me and said, "So you're telling me that we need to have empathy for our end users in order to pursue this career path of like user-centered design?" And it's like, yeah. And then like, I don't do that. So are you telling me that I can't do this job? And it's like, uh, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah,
Like,
probably not well.
yeah, you might want to explore other career options, honestly.
What an
Like, if you're
interesting
not
thing to say.
into, yeah, and I like, if you're that
I don't use
self-aware, good
empathy.
for you. Like, but you might not want to pursue a job where like it really, really helps to care about what it's like to be another person, right? And like try to understand their world and their worldview.
Wow.
Yeah, it matters a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I think like I choose to work with people who do have a lot of empathy and like are curious about other people, because I think that's how we do a better job of designing things for other people.
And also, to be clear, I feel like it needs to be said. Empathy is not a gift. It's not
No, it's
something
a
you are endowed
skill.
with. It's a skill. You
Yeah,
learn it. You
you
can be
do.
more empathetic. You just got to practice.
Yeah, you choose to learn it. You choose to
Yep.
practice it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
I love that. And I love that you not just do it, but I think there's a big difference between doing and making the thing that you're doing very explicit. So, obviously in your work, you are bringing empathy to the table, but also when you are talking about your work, when you are teaching, when you are marketing, that is an explicit part of the conversation, which I think is necessary because I don't think it's implied. I don't think most people
yeah.
think about that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And often, right, like empathy gets poo-pooed as like, oh, that's a soft skill, it'd be nice to have. I don't know if you have to have it, but like you have to have it if you're in this career path. Otherwise you're not going to make it, right? You're going to miss something important. You're going to design the wrong thing, right? And it's not going to end up well.
And I think we can all think of examples in our lives when we've experienced that with technology. I'm facing one right now in the setting where I work, where they issued me a computer. And I don't like this computer because I was trained on a different type of computer.
Ah,
And the type of
yes.
computer I was trained on is very user friendly. And
Yeah.
every day I'm having to switch between the two, and I want to
Oh,
throw it out the
no.
window.
Oh, my
And I don't want
gosh.
to start a war, so I'm not going to name any brands,
Right. But I can guess.
but you can guess.
Yes.
And that's such an interesting thing that there's almost like a tribalism that comes
Oh,
from certain user experiences because this is easy and that's complicated. And why would
right.
I do that
It's
versus
all
this?
relative. Right. Right. It depends on what
Right.
you've got practice with. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that is a
That's
complicated one.
fascinating. And also, why is it in this field? And you mentioned it at the beginning that sometimes you'll see, sometimes with engineers, but I think you see this across the board. You see it in all different aspects of academic science as well, or even just academics, that there's a certain percentage of individuals who relish the idea of broadening the message and saying, I want to make this deeply accessible. And then there's other people who feel somehow special the less accessible their experience is.
Yes,
Like,
this
I
is
have my friends who are like,
totally
I
true.
only use Linux machines.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, like,
I've worked with those people. Yes, that is
right. And it's like, I'm very proud of you. Like, I don't, but
right.
cool, good for you. Like, this does not impress me. You know, like, where does that
Yeah.
come from?
I mean, I think tribalism is a great way to describe that, right? You're trying to identify with a group of people that you feel are special and that you want to be a member of. And, part of tribalism is like there's in group and there's out group. So you got to have an out group, right? And it might as well be them because they can't handle command lines, right? Or they don't like Ubuntu, my version, right? So it makes us feel special, right? When we're members of a club,
So, how
whatever
do you
lines you want to use to draw them.
Yeah. How do you overcome that in your work though? Because I can imagine that sometimes you're actually facing that in a corporate setting or you're facing that in an engineering setting. And like it's your role, I would guess, to try and convince individuals like that is not going to give us the best bang for our buck. Like
Yeah.
that's not going to reach people.
Yeah. That's happened more than a few times. I think so. The best example I have of where I think we made a little bit of progress towards changing their minds it was back when I was working at Willow Garage. We are working on the robot operating system, which is ROS, and there was this in open source software culture. There is often the sense of like, well, if you can't use it, then you're just too dumb and you don't get to use it, right? It's a little, it's the tribe, right? And you either belong to the tribe or you don't. And if you can't, then we don't care, right? But there's also some people on our team who are very interested in, what they would call, say, democratizing robotics, right? And like putting these capabilities in the hands of more people. Those two things are in conflict. And so I started, just talking to folks walking around the parking lot, trying to understand where they're coming from. And I kept asking them, like, okay, so who's this for? Right? Just like we were talking about earlier. And they would come around to like, well, it'd be really cool if, the top PhD students and the top robotics programs would use our stuff. But they don't. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. So it just so happens that the university right next door to where we were was Stanford, and they had one of the top, PhD programs in robotics. So I grabbed a bunch of friends I had in that program. I was like, "Hey, you want to come over and try some new software? We have
Mhm.
cookies." Uh, and so they came over for the cookies and stuck around for the code too. And we actually ran some user studies with them where we told them, "Okay, go ahead and like try to build a little robot model, right? And try to run it in the simulator." And oh my gosh, it was so frustrating for them. Um, and our team who was working on the software development for Ross were like, why can't they use it? Like these guys are smart. These women are smart, like, but they can't use our tool. And so I think it helped a little to say, like, okay, you're trying to get these people to be able to do this thing. And no, you don't get to stand next to them and show them how to do it because you can't do that at scale. Um, and I think it helped us to build this practice of like, let's bring in those people who we think should be able to use it, let them try it, get some feedback from them, and then make it better for them over time, right? And iterate. And that's just like basic, user-centered design 101. But I
Yeah.
think it was kind of newer for the folks who were used to developing code for themselves, right, and their friends.
Yeah.
So just bringing that to the table, I think, can start to make some headway in a good direction.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm reminded, and I think I might have even mentioned this on the last episode, but I just recently watched this documentary about Reading Rainbow, which I loved Reading
I grew
Rainbow
up on that.
and loved it.
That is great
And
stuff.
it's such a
Yeah.
lovely, like, just kind of,
Yeah.
it's such a good documentary to watch if you need a boost.
Cool.
But there was a part in it where the executive producers were talking about how, like, we're a bunch of adults trying to write a show for children and try and come up with what children would want or what's too much for them or what's not enough for them. Like, you can't do that unless you sit with the kids and you
Mhm.
focus group the show.
Mhm.
Like, we are adults writing
Right.
for children. We need the
Right.
children to
We've
tell us if
lost
it's
that
working.
perspective. Totally play testing it, right?
It's such an easy concept, but I think it kind of goes back to this weird thing where, like, when you've busted your ass and you've got the expertise and the accolades, then somehow you need to prove to everybody else that, like, well, I'm smart enough to do this thing, and so I want it to only be like I'm the key to this lock. Like,
Right. I will
only
just figure
smart
it
people
out.
should. But the truth of the
Yeah.
matter is, I don't want everything in my daily life to require that I use that level of cognition. I want most of the things in my life to be really easy.
Right. You've got enough things to worry about and think about,
Yeah,
right? And spend your cognitive effort on. So it doesn't need to be also like, driving your car home shouldn't feel like a massive effort at the end of the
right,
day. Yeah.
right. Like, why does my medical, electronic medical record software make me feel
Yeah.
like I'm taking an exam every day?
You are not alone in that feeling. That is what almost every doctor I know complains to me about too. Yes,
And
there's
so
a massive pain point in that industry.
there is, and so these are the things. This kind of takes us. I love this. Like, here towards the end of our conversation, these are the things that are fundamental to the work that you do, right? So I would love to hear about, like, what is robust AI and what is it that you do there?
Sure. So Robust AI started as an AI company, and we kind of got forced into becoming a robotics company because we chose a problem to work on and we chose a user group to care about. And so those people are warehouse workers. When you order stuff online, they're the people who actually like are physically going and finding the stuff that you ordered, putting it on a cart, loading it into a box, and shipping it out to you. And there is a super high demand for that. It's increasing, but nobody wants those jobs. And they're quitting at ridiculous rates. This is
Yeah,
not
because
just a
they're really,
COVID
really
thing.
hard jobs.
It's rough, and it can be
It's
rough
really,
on your body.
and to
Um,
make it financially feasible, they're probably not
yes,
getting paid nearly enough.
right. Especially when you've got supposedly free shipping, right? So those margins are tiny. Um, but I think there's a really cool opportunity there to make their lives better. And the nice thing is that now their bosses are very incentivized to make their lives better because they're having such a hard time recruiting people and they're having an even harder time retaining them. And so there's this beautiful alignment between like, well, the bosses want people to be there and they want them to stay. And the users are really frustrated, but I think we can actually make their lives better. And so at Robust, we are working on a push cart that happens to have a robot inside. um, and so this push cart can drive itself around. It doesn't have to be pushed around by a person. So you can sort of, it'll valet park itself if you want it to. You can call it over when you want to use it. But when you actually want to show it what to do, you grab it by its handlebars and push it around, right? And so it's a very familiar form factor. Um, and now, after thinking about chatting with you, now I'm wondering, like, is this like the horse-drawn cart? Um, that maybe we're at that stage. Maybe we have more learning to do. I'm sure we
Well,
have
we
more learning to do.
first, right? You can't skip ahead to the Cybertruck because then you're like,
Yes.
"What the hell is that? I don't want that."
Yeah. Yeah. That thing is sharp and pointy, man.
Also, I don't wanna
Um,
give it that much credit. That is not skipping ahead, but yes, go
that is a vision of the future.
exactly. You take my point. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
doesn't have to be my vision.
Right.
Yeah, so it's been super fun for me, like getting to hang out with warehouse workers, getting to spend time seeing how they actually do the problem solving. And the coolest thing is, there's this sort of meme out there that's like, we don't need no stinking humans. We're just going to make a dark warehouse, right? And the whole warehouse is a robot. And it turns out that doesn't work very well. um, it's the humans in the loop who make the whole stupid thing run, right? And they figure out, like, well, actually, you have to shim this one machine this way to make it do its thing properly, right? And those little tricks are what makes the whole operation work or not work. And so if you take the opposite assumption of, like, actually, we do need those people and we need to value them and we need to treat them better and make more humane working conditions, I think that's a better winning way forward. And so we're sort of betting on that hypothesis right now and trying to make um, more capable push carts that make the load feel lighter, that make it easier to find the thing you're looking for, and make you walk fewer steps. There's some of these warehouse workers can walk like 30,000 steps or more per day. And like, it's good to get some exercise, but that's a lot.
That's
And it can be
brutal.
very
Yeah, what
taxing
I
on
think
your
the goal is, what,
body.
7,000 a day? Isn't that what we're
Yeah,
all
like
aiming for? Something
it
like that?
doesn't, yeah, you don't need that much of a workout just at work, right? And then it limits who can actually participate in those jobs, right? And so I think we have a pretty cool chance to try to make these jobs better and make them more accessible for a broader range of people too, which would be pretty cool. So the bar is very high for design. Um, there are many different languages spoken in these warehouses, and so we have to support all of them, right? And I think, to me, it's a fun challenge to work on, because if we don't get the user-centered design right, then we've failed just as a company. And yes, the machine learning part of it matters. Yes, the mechanical design really matters too. And so this is a time when, like, we get to test our ability to work together as an interdisciplinary team to work on a real world problem, right? As opposed to, let's make a robot and then figure out what it's for later, right? uh, which is a kind of more typical in this industry.
I'm curious, thinking about the work that you're specifically doing right now. I can imagine that when you're talking to different stakeholders, when you're talking to individuals who are, curious about this type of progress, that a common question that comes up is, okay, yes, you're trying to make it so that the people and the robots can work together seamlessly and blah 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 blah. But isn't the goal ultimately to do the dark warehouse? Like, maybe we're just not doing the dark warehouse because we're not there yet technologically. Like, how do you respond to um that question?
Yeah, I think of it as, like, there's short term and long term. And right now, I think there's an obvious direction to go for the short term. Because if you look at the fully autonomous systems, like, there's lots of startups and other larger companies that are making the dark warehouse bet. And we're seeing how that's panning out, and it's tough, because you need to be very sure that the items that you're shipping are always going to be the same items, right? If you build a big warehouse robot and it's got totes that are a certain size for carrying stuff, and then suddenly now you're carrying bigger items that don't fit in those totes, right? What you going to do? And so they tend to be very brittle solutions, and then they end up having to, like, build yet another warehouse where they handle all the other stuff that doesn't fit.
Right. So
And
they're too
so,
narrow. Oh, that's interesting.
yeah, like, it can work if you're very sure that you're never going to change what you're shipping, and you're pretty
Yeah.
sure you're never going to change your order profile. So, if you're e-commerce, like, holiday time is insane, right? They call it peak season, and being ready for that is really hard, right? You got to flex up and down very quickly in response to whatever customers are ordering, and that can be hard. So I think it's really the dynamic nature of that industry that makes it super hard to have very, like, brittle solutions. So I would bet on, actually, like, what happens now is people get it done, right? Um, and we just get it done better. And they can be really great entry level jobs for folks who are entering a new space, right? That they haven't worked in before, or a country that they haven't worked in before, and make
Absolutely. And we
opportunities
need
for those
that.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we need that to have a functioning economy and to have a functioning social, net. It's I guess here, sort of at the end of the hour, this then leads us to the big question that's often kind of on the tip of everybody's tongues, and not to get too dystopian and not to get too dark, but you know yes, you said that there are those startups that are working on the dark warehouse, and of course that's just a synecdoche, right? That's like an example of something larger. But often when we talk about AI and robotics, we go to that extreme place of like general right intelligence, or of sort of the robots taking over, this like what happens if and when. And you have a realistic handle on where we are now, kind of the I guess we could say the way that the future is progressing. I work with a lot of people who either consider themselves futurists or who are just very like interested and enamored with the world of robotics and AI. And I find a lot of them to be like massive techno optimists. I sometimes worry that I'm like the wet blanket, like I'm a bit of a cynic, and I want to really net out in a place that is authentic and realistic. And so I guess this is my long way to ask, kind of, where do you find your sensibilities when it comes to what a long picture might look like, and what the future, maybe there's a difference between could hold versus where you actually think the future is headed?
Yeah, I think this got pounded into me in grad school. But there's
Okay.
this
Yeah.
notion of like the future isn't just this thing that's coming at us, right?
Right.
Especially with technology, like we are literally deciding what we want that future to look like, because we are actively participating in it. And so I feel like, if that dystopian future comes to pass, that's our fault, right? Because we're choosing to take that path. And I agree with you. There's a ton of techno optimists out there. There's also techno pessimists, right? There's lots of sci-fi that shows us that, if we push on this one dimension in the wrong way, the world's going to end, right? And I think those are good warnings. They're good possible futures to consider. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's our responsibility to be involved in inventing the future that we actually want to live in. And that's my old mentor, Stu Card, is the one who I blame for saying it because it's stuck in my head forever. And I feel like if we don't take action now to participate in the design of that future, then we kind of only have ourselves to blame, right?
Yeah.
And figuring
Yeah.
out how to make that participation more inclusive of all the people who this is going to impact, is also critical, right, to a success that is good for more people than just the ones who invented it at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of that's an important question in and of itself, right? Is that this future that is what it is because of how we shape it is there are specifics here, and obviously I'm not looking for some sort of like exhaustive list here at the close of the show, but obviously having more viewpoints, more seats at the table, people with different life experiences, really having a lot of power in the conversations is one fundamentally important part of shaping that future. But what are some other examples of things that you think are important to help shape that future in a way that is responsible and safe, and I guess like more humanistic?
Yeah, yeah. There is a beautiful framework that's in one of my favorite textbooks on human factors and the design of technologies, and it's updated, thankfully. The original version of this was called MABA MABA, which was stood for Men Are Better At and Machines Are Better At.
Oh God.
It's from the 70s.
Yeah,
That has changed,
that's
and
good.
now it's like people are better at versus
Mhm.
machines are better at. And of course, like the things machines are better at has changed too, right, in the last few decades. And I think, we're talking about like, why are we building things that are exactly like ourselves when we know that we have so many limitations? Um, I think that a better future that could be one in which we look for the complementary skills and for the complementary strengths that can help us to overcome our limitations, right? So, forgetting can be good sometimes, but when I forget my keys at home, that's not so great, right? And so being able to figure out how to design tools, including computational tools, right, that help us to overcome our psychological limitations, our physical limitations, right? We're seeing robots being used for things like exploring space and exploring the deep sea because, quite frankly, our bodies couldn't handle that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that future to me is brighter, because it's, first of all, being self reflective about what we're bad at and what we're good at, right? And then designing for the rest of it, right? And designing for the complementary skills, I think, is a more productive way of thinking about what's worth building right
I love
now.
that. And the future is now because we are already doing this and we don't often stop to reflect on it. Like I do not know how to get anywhere without my GPS and I don't
Oh,
know
me too.
anybody's phone number because they're saved in my phone. And
Yes.
that's a good thing because
Yeah.
that is real estate I don't need to be
Right.
taken up,
Yeah. You've
you
freed it
know?
up to do other things now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such a wonderful way to kind of close out this discussion. But before we go, I guess I should ask if there's anything that we didn't cover, or if there's anything that you feel like, oh God, no, we got to make sure we mention this.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things that we could talk about, and I'd be happy
I
to chat
know.
again anytime.
Excellent.
Oh gosh, that is a great question. Um, I think I would not recommend that we do this right now. But there is this question of, again, from like films like Her, right? This question of our relationship with these technologies, and how we make sense of them and what that means about us.
Right.
Um,
And how can we be humanistic, even though that might not be a human? Because I
yeah.
do worry the sort of genocidal playbook here, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
the more that we teach something that is quote unhuman or quote subhuman a certain kind of way, the more that we can easily translate that to our interactions with actual humans.
Oh, totally. A good friend of mine named his daughter Alexa just
Mhm.
before Amazon
Oh
launched Alexa.
god.
And now she's in school, and that can be, that it's unfortunate that they picked the same name, right? Because now there's all this baggage that comes with that name, right? Like play music, Alexa, right? Like you're just commanding. And it doesn't need to be that way, right? So you're right. Yeah, how does that shape our understanding of our interactions with each other, right? And how we value other people, versus other kinds of agents, right? That can feel social, even if deep down we rationally know that they're not real people, right?
Right. Yeah, and I guess my take is I wanna always aid on or, aid? That's not the right word I'm looking for. I want
Air?
to err on the
Yeah.
side of kindness, like, even if it's to a robot, because I feel
Yeah.
like it's like empathy, like we said, is a skill. You just need to
Right.
practice it all the time. If I'm
Yeah.
kind to my robots, I know that I'm reinforcing just being kind.
Mhm, mhm. Right, right. Yeah, and when I see people abusing robots, which does happen pretty often, it kinda makes you wonder, like, what are they like when they go
Right.
home?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Fascinating, gosh. And like you said, of course, there are so many more topics that we could cover, but hopefully this was a good kind of smorgasbord of
Yes.
different things. And I'm hoping that it could sort of whet some people's appetites to learn more and to dig a little bit deeper and just to be a little bit maybe more mindful in their engagements with technology. I just can't thank you enough, Leila, for A, the work that you do, but B, for spending the time with us sharing about it today.
Thank you for spending the time with me. These were amazing questions, and so many juicy topics to work on together. There's a lot more that we still need to do.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, there's more we need to do too. So I just want to thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.